At 3:42 in the afternoon on December 8, 1944, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt stood inside Davies Son General Store in the village of Bishops Cleeve, Gloucestershire, holding a broom and a dustpan, trying to understand what was happening. 25 years old, captured 9 weeks earlier in Belgium, transported to England on a troop ship, expecting a prison camp that looked like the ones described in Wehrmacht intelligence briefings, labour gangs, punishment details, starvation rations. Instead, the British sergeant standing beside him, a man named Wilson, had just introduced him to an elderly shopkeeper who needed help moving stock, and Schmidt had no idea if this was surveillance or something else entirely. The shopkeeper was smiling. Mr. Davies had told Wilson and the 4 Germans waiting by the door that his back wasn't what it used to be, that Christmas stock needed organising, that an extra pair of hands would be appreciated. Schmidt thought he had misunderstood the English. A shop, British civilians, German prisoners working among people buying groceries. The mathematics refused to align. Schmidt had surrendered to British forces on October 2nd near Arnhem. His unit, the 9th SS Panzer Division, had been defending against Operation Market Garden when British paratroopers overwhelmed their position. When the artillery barrage lifted and British infantry advanced, Schmidt and 41 other men walked forward with their hands raised. The British had been professional. They disarmed the prisoners, separated them by rank, processed them through a field collection point where hundreds of German soldiers sat in wire enclosures waiting for trucks. Schmidt spent 8 days at that collection point before being loaded onto vehicles heading north to the coast. The Channel crossing took 9 hours. The troopship carried 250 German prisoners below deck. The conditions were tight. Too many bodies in too small a space, the smell of diesel and seasickness, the constant fear that a U-boat might torpedo the ship without realising Germans were aboard. When the ship docked at Harwich on October the 12th, Schmidt had eaten nothing but hard biscuits and tinned meat for 3 days. British military police marched the prisoners onto trains. Schmidt's group travelled west through Essex, through London's northern suburbs, into the Cotswolds. The landscape changed. Industrial areas gave way to farmland, then to rolling hills, covered in limestone walls and sheep pastures. The countryside looked untouched by war, peaceful, nothing like the devastated regions of Holland and Belgium where Schmidt had been fighting. By the time they reached Camp 118 near Cheltenham on October 15th, Schmidt understood he was in rural England, surrounded by people whose cities Germany had bombed, people who had every reason to hate him. Camp 118 sat on 50 acres of requisitioned farmland 6 miles southeast of Cheltenham town centre. The base had been constructed in mid-1944 as a temporary holding facility for prisoners awaiting assignment to agricultural labour across the region. By autumn 1944, it housed 350 German prisoners of war. Schmidt and his group were processed through the intake hut on the western perimeter. They were photographed, fingerprinted, issued British battle dress uniforms dyed brown with large circular PW patches sewn onto the back and legs. Canvas shoes, wool blankets, a tin mug and plate. They were assigned to huts, wooden structures with corrugated iron roofs and small coal stoves. 18 men per hut. Each man received a metal cot, a wooden footlocker, and a small shelf. Schmidt had expected worse. Instead, he found something basic but functional. The huts were drafty but weatherproof. The latrines had running water. The mess hall served hot food twice a day. On his first night at Camp 118, Schmidt ate potato soup, brown bread, margarine, and tea. Not generous portions, but more food than he had seen in the last 6 weeks of fighting in Holland. He sat at a wooden table with other new arrivals and tried to understand what kind of prison served its inmates soup and tea. A lance corporal named Weber, another prisoner who had been at Camp 118 for 5 months, explained the situation. Britain had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive adequate food, housing, and medical care. Britain was following the rules, though limited by wartime rationing. British civilians were on strict rations. Butter, sugar, meat, tea were all controlled. The prisoners would receive similar rations to British civilians, sometimes slightly less, but always enough to meet minimum convention standards. They would work, mostly agricultural labour or community assistance, helping British villages that had lost workers to military service. They would be paid small amounts in camp vouchers. They would receive adequate clothing and shelter. They would not be beaten or starved or executed. Weber said all of this while eating his soup, and Schmidt realised the lance corporal was telling the truth. This was policy, constrained by wartime scarcity, but still policy. The work began on October the 19th. Schmidt and 25 other prisoners were trucked to farms 12 miles north of camp. The farms stretched across the Gloucestershire countryside, fields being prepared for winter, root vegetables being harvested before frost. The farmer, a man named Atkins, explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner would help with harvest work, digging potatoes, pulling turnips, clearing fields. Work hours were 7 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with a 1-hour break for lunch. The labour was repetitive but straightforward. Once the day's quota was met, prisoners could rest. Atkins made it clear that cooperation benefited everyone. The farms needed labour. The prisoners needed occupation. Neither side gained from conflict. Schmidt started working at 7:15 that first morning. The labour was physical. Dig, pull, carry, stack. The October air was cold. By 9 o'clock, Schmidt's hands were muddy and sore. By 11 o'clock, his back ached from bending. By noon, he understood the work would continue like this for months. British farms were perpetually short of labour. There was always something needing harvest, something needing repair. Schmidt finished his assigned section by 4:20 in the afternoon. He stacked his tools by the barn and walked to the farmyard to report completion. Atkins checked the work, marked Schmidt's name on a clipboard. Schmidt was done, 40 minutes early. He sat on a stone wall with 3 other prisoners who had also finished and waited for the truck to take them back to camp. That evening in the hut, Weber told Schmidt about the village work details. Some Saturdays, prisoners could volunteer for community assistance in nearby villages, under guard supervision. Light work, different from farm labour. Schmidt asked what kind of community work. Weber's expression was cautious. Sometimes shop assistance. Schmidt thought Weber was exaggerating. He was not. On Saturday, December the 9th, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a British sergeant named Wilson walked through the camp compound, announcing that 5 prisoners could volunteer for a work detail at Davies Son General Store in Bishops Cleeve. Supervised activity, 3-hour duration, return by 6 o'clock. Schmidt volunteered. He had not seen a British village except from truck windows. The idea of working in a civilian shop seemed impossible. Prisoners did not interact with civilians, they worked in fields or labour gangs, but Weber had said it was real. And Schmidt wanted to see if that was true. That was how Schmidt ended up standing inside Davies & Son at 3:42 in the afternoon, watching Mr. Davies gesture toward boxes of tinned goods, while telling Sergeant Wilson that Christmas inventory needed organising. The shop sat on Bishops Cleeve's main street. Stone building, small front window, bell that rang when the door opened. The interior was crowded with shelves holding everything a village needed. Tinned foods, soap, candles, thread, tobacco, sweets in jars, newspapers, writing paper. The smell was distinctive. Dust, tobacco, soap, wood polish. The smell of commerce and daily life. Mr. Davies was maybe 65, white-haired, wearing a brown shop coat and wire-rimmed glasses. He walked with a slight limp. He spoke to Wilson in a quiet voice, then turned to the prisoners. He needed help moving stock from the back room to the shelves. Christmas was coming. People would be buying more, even with rationing. The shop needed to be organised. Simple work. Lifting, carrying, stacking. Wilson would supervise. The prisoners would work carefully and respectfully. Schmidt picked up a box of tinned soup from the back room. He carried it to the front and started stacking tins on a shelf. The work was simple but strange. He was inside a British shop, handling British products that British civilians would buy and take home and eat, products that sustained the enemy population. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The shop door opened. A woman entered, maybe 40, wearing a coat and headscarf, carrying a shopping basket. She looked at the prisoners. She saw the PW patches. She understood what they were. German prisoners. Enemies. Men from the country that had bombed British cities, killed British soldiers, threatened British existence. She froze for 2 seconds. Then Mr. Davies spoke. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Palmer. Just doing some organising. How can I help you today?" His tone was normal, cheerful, as if having German prisoners stacking shelves was completely ordinary. Mrs. Palmer hesitated, then approached the counter. "Just bread and tea, please, Mr. Davies." Her voice was tight but controlled. Mr. Davies gathered her items, took her ration coupons, made change from the till. Mrs. Palmer took her basket and left without looking at the prisoners again. The bell rang as the door closed. Schmidt continued stacking tins. His hands were shaking. That woman had just shared space with him, a German soldier, in her village shop during a war. And Mr. Davies had treated it as normal, as if Germans stacking shelves and British civilians shopping were compatible activities. The work continued. Schmidt and the other prisoners moved boxes, organised shelves, swept floors. Wilson watched from near the door but did not interfere. Mr. Davies moved through the shop, checking inventory, occasionally directing the prisoners to different tasks. At one point, he asked Schmidt to reach a high shelf to retrieve a box of candles. Schmidt complied. Mr. Davies thanked him. "That's very helpful, thank you." Not effusive, just polite. Acknowledgement. At 4:30, Mr. Davies called everyone to the back room. He had prepared tea, 5 cups on a wooden table. He gestured for the prisoners to sit. Wilson looked uncertain but did not object. The prisoners sat. Mr. Davies poured tea from a pot, added milk from a jug, offered sugar from a small bowl, 1 spoonful per cup. Sugar was strictly rationed. This was a sacrifice. Schmidt took his cup and held it. He had not been offered tea by a civilian since before the war. The tea was hot, sweet, comforting. Mr. Davies sat across from them and drank his own tea. After a moment, he spoke. His voice was quiet. "My son was at Dunkirk, Royal Engineers. He made it home, but he hasn't been the same since. War's a terrible thing." Silence. What could the prisoners say? Mr. Davies continued. "I don't know what you did during this war. I don't know if you did terrible things or if you just followed orders. But you're here now, you're working, and I appreciate the help." He sipped his tea. "When this is over, you'll go home. Try to build something better than what came before." Schmidt sat with his tea and tried to process what Mr. Davies had just said. This man's son had fought against Germany, had survived Dunkirk, was damaged by the experience. And yet this man was sharing tea with German prisoners, thanking them for help, offering something like forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement of shared humanity. The mathematics still did not work. The prisoners finished their tea. They returned to the shop floor and completed the remaining work. By 5:30, the stock was organised, shelves were full, floors were swept. Mr. Davies inspected the work and nodded. "Good job. Thank you, gentlemen." He spoke to Wilson briefly, then turned back to the prisoners. "If you're here again, you're welcome to help. Seems like we can get along well enough." It was not a grand statement, just an observation, but it carried weight. The truck arrived at 5:45. The prisoners climbed into the back, rode to camp in silence. Schmidt sat with his hands folded, staring at his boots. He had spent 3 hours inside a British shop. He had stacked shelves with products British civilians would buy. He had drunk tea offered by a shopkeeper whose son had fought Germany. He had been thanked for his work. None of it made sense. That night, back in the hut, Schmidt wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. The letters were censored, so he could not write about camp locations or work details or anything militarily useful. He could only write about his health and general conditions. He wrote that he was safe, that the British were treating him according to rules, that he had worked in a shop that day. He knew his wife would not understand that last part. He did not understand it himself, but it had happened. The shop work continued through December and January. Once every 2 weeks, depending on weather and guard availability, prisoners who had maintained good behaviour could volunteer for community assistance at Davies Son or other shops in nearby villages. The work always followed the same pattern. 5 prisoners, 2 guards, 3 hours, return by evening. The guards always brought their rifles, but they never needed them. No prisoner attempted to escape during these details. Where would they go? They were in the middle of England, wearing uniforms marked with PW. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically foolish, and most prisoners did not want to escape. The conditions at Camp 118 were better than the conditions they had experienced in the Wehrmacht during the final months of fighting in Holland and Belgium. Regular food, shelter, no artillery, no Allied fighter bombers, no constant threat of death. Some prisoners called it surreal captivity, comfortable but morally disorienting. Schmidt called it something else. He called it a window into ordinary life. The alternative was remaining in the war, which by late 1944 meant retreating into Germany, defending against overwhelming Allied forces, or being sent to the Eastern Front, where entire armies were being annihilated. The alternative was death. So Schmidt harvested vegetables, organised shop inventory, played cards in the hut, and waited for the war to end. The farm work continued through November and December. Schmidt became efficient at agricultural labour. By his 5th week, he could complete his daily tasks by 3:45 in the afternoon. That gave him over an hour of rest before the truck returned to camp. He spent that time sitting in barn doorways, watching British farm workers. The workers were mostly older men or women from the Land Army. They treated the German prisoners with neither friendship nor hostility. They were practical. The work needed doing. The prisoners did the work. Personal feelings were secondary to keeping farms productive. In January, the work shifted. Winter weather made outdoor labour difficult. Atkins, the farmer, told the prisoners they would be reassigned to other projects. Some would go to timber felling in forests. Others would work road maintenance. Schmidt's group was sent to a warehouse near Gloucester, sorting and packing supplies for military distribution. The prisoners worked sorting and stacking, following instructions from civilian supervisors who demonstrated each task once and expected competence. The hours were the same, 7 o'clock to 5 o'clock. But the work was indoors, warmer than farm labour. Schmidt had no warehouse experience. He learned by watching and asking questions. By February 1945, Schmidt had earned 42 shillings in camp vouchers. He spent it at the camp canteen on cigarettes, writing paper and soap. The canteen also sold razor blades, bootlaces and playing cards, items that made captivity more bearable. Schmidt bought razor blades and writing paper. Staying clean and staying connected to his wife were the few things he could control. The news from the war filtered into camp through newspapers the guards shared in the recreation hut. By February 1945, Allied armies were crossing the Rhine into Germany. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were advancing toward Berlin. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts against overwhelming forces. Schmidt understood the mathematics. Germany could not win. The only question was when surrender would come and how many more cities would be destroyed before it did. Schmidt hoped his wife had survived the bombing. Hamburg had been devastated in 1943. He had not received a letter from her in 3 months. The uncertainty was worse than captivity. In March, the shop work stopped. Mr. Davies had fallen ill. Wilson said the old shopkeeper was recovering but needed rest. The shop was being run by his daughter temporarily. Volunteers for shop work would resume when Mr. Davies returned. Schmidt hoped the old man recovered. That thought surprised him, caring about the health of a British civilian, an enemy civilian. But Mr. Davies had offered tea and kindness when he could have offered nothing that mattered. Instead, the camp organised other activities: football matches, language classes, film screenings in the recreation hall. The films were British productions, newsreels, and documentaries with German subtitles. Schmidt watched a film about British war production. The film portrayed British workers as dedicated and resilient. Schmidt thought it was propaganda, but not inaccurate propaganda. Britain had survived, Germany had not. The other prisoners watched quietly. No one discussed it afterward. The food rations remained adequate through winter and spring 1945. Soup, bread, margarine, occasional meat, tea. The same rations British civilians received under rationing. The prisoners did not gain weight, but they did not starve. Schmidt had weighed 151 pounds when he arrived at Camp 118 in October 1944. By April 1945, he weighed 157 pounds. The difference was visible. He was no longer the exhausted soldier who had surrendered in Holland. He was healthier now than he had been in 18 months. But the rations changed in May 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. 5 days later, the camp administration called an assembly. The prisoners gathered in the main yard. The camp commandant, Major Edwards, stood on a platform and explained the situation. News had reached Britain about German concentration camps. Photographs from Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz had been published. Images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder. British civilians were horrified and angry. Parliament was demanding that German POWs receive reduced rations as punishment. Edwards said he understood the anger, but orders were clear. Rations would be reduced. Minimum Geneva Convention standards would be maintained. Work assignments would continue. Shop privileges would not resume. The prisoners accepted the announcement without protest. What could they protest? They had not known about the camps. Most of them claimed they had not known. Schmidt had heard whispers during his time in the Wehrmacht, rumours about camps in Poland, about deportations, about things soldiers were not supposed to discuss. He had dismissed the rumours as exaggerations, enemy propaganda designed to justify the war against Germany. But the photographs did not lie. The survivors did not lie. Schmidt sat in his hut after the assembly and tried to reconcile what he had believed with what he now knew. Germany had not just lost a war, Germany had committed atrocities that would define it forever, and he had been part of it. Not a camp guard, not directly responsible, but he had worn the uniform, he had fought for the regime, he had enabled it through his service. That made him complicit. The other prisoners did not want to discuss it. They wanted to focus on going home, on finding family, on rebuilding. Schmidt could not focus on those things. The photographs stayed with him. The evidence of what his country had done would not fade. The rations improved again by August 1945. The camp administration restored fuller meals after the initial public outrage diminished. But the atmosphere had changed. The guards became more distant. The casual interactions stopped. The shop work never resumed. Mr. Davies had recovered, but the arrangement ended. Recreation activities continued, but the tone was different. The war was over, but the moral reckoning had just begun. Schmidt remained at Camp 118 until March 1946. The repatriation process was slow. Thousands of German prisoners were held in camps across Britain, and transporting them back to Germany required coordination with authorities managing millions of displaced persons across Europe. Schmidt's turn came on March 14, 1946. He and 180 other prisoners were loaded onto buses and driven to Southampton, where they boarded a transport ship bound for Hamburg. The voyage took 5 days. Schmidt spent most of the time below deck staring at the metal ceiling, thinking about the past 17 months. He had left Germany in 1944 as a soldier. He was returning in 1946 as a prisoner, with memories of organising shelves in a Gloucestershire shop, while a British shopkeeper offered tea and spoke about building something better. The ship docked at Hamburg on March 19th. British authorities processed the prisoners through a transit centre, then released them to find their own way home. Schmidt walked through Hamburg's ruins for 6 hours before finding the neighbourhood where he had lived. The street was gone. Rubble, collapsed buildings, burnt timber. He searched for 2 days before finding someone who knew what had happened to his wife. She had died in a bombing raid in January 1945. 7 weeks before Germany surrendered, 7 weeks before the war ended, Schmidt stood in the ruins of his old neighbourhood and tried to understand. His wife had survived years of bombing, then died weeks before peace. He had survived years of combat, then spent comfortable months as a prisoner while his wife died. The mathematics of war made no sense. The cruelty was random and complete. Schmidt stayed in Hamburg and tried to rebuild. There was no work. The economy was destroyed. Currency was worthless. People traded cigarettes and bread. Schmidt found jobs in construction, clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure. The pay was minimal, but it bought food. He worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, rebuilding a city that would take decades to recover. He never talked about Britain. When people asked where he had been during the war, he said Holland and left it at that. But he thought about Britain constantly. He thought about Davies Son General Store, about stacking shelves while British civilians shopped. He thought about Mr. Davies offering tea and speaking about his son. He thought about being treated with basic dignity when Germany deserved none. And he realised something. Mr. Davies had not been naive. The old shopkeeper had known what Germany had done, what Germans had done to Britain. But he had chosen to treat Schmidt with dignity anyway. Not because Schmidt deserved it, not because Germany deserved it, but because humanity required it. That was the lesson Schmidt carried forward. Not that Britain was perfect, not that Germany's crimes were forgivable, but that humanity could survive even in the worst circumstances if people chose to preserve it. One small act at a time. Schmidt lived in Hamburg for the rest of his life. He never remarried. He worked as a construction supervisor, eventually managed a small building company. He never returned to Britain. He never tried to contact Mr. Davies or Sergeant Wilson or any of the people he had known at Camp 118, but he kept one item from his time as a prisoner, a small tin of tea, British tea, that Mr. Davies had given him on his last day at the shop. The tin was empty, rusted, the label faded. Schmidt kept the tin on a shelf in his apartment. His nephew found it after Schmidt died in 1994. He asked neighbours what it was. They said Schmidt had been a prisoner of war in Britain during the war, and that a British shopkeeper had treated him with unexpected kindness, that the experience had changed him, that he had never forgotten it. The tin now sits in a small local history museum in Hamburg, as part of an exhibition about ordinary soldiers and the long shadows of war. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like any other artifact, a rusted tin with a faded label. But it is not. It is evidence of a moment when an enemy was treated with dignity by a man who had every reason to hate. Evidence that proves even in war, even in captivity, even between nations trying to destroy each other, humanity can survive if people choose to preserve it. And sometimes the greatest kindness is not grand gestures, but small acts of ordinary decency. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're sharing forgotten stories like this every single day. Real history, real people, real moments of humanity in impossible circumstances. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Britain, Germany, the United States, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. Let us know you're here. Tell us if someone in your family ran a shop during the war, or if you remember seeing prisoners in your village. Just let us know you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, And thank you for making sure Wilhelm Schmidt and the thousands of other POWs who experienced this strange mercy are not forgotten. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.